Can I please welcome to the stage Eric Pinkerton? Click. Yeah? Oh, no. Where's Eric? Noah? We don't want Noah. Yes, no, we do want Noah, don't we?
She's a clean.
No, it's not the real Noah then. Oh, yours isn't working?
Yeah, it's just not plugged into anything. Right.
Oh, okay.
Look, the trouble I go to for you guys. You won't catch the government guys dressing up, cosplaying as memes. Okay. I think this is funny. Wait till you see my wife's reaction to me spending $100 on a cheap gag. Okay. I changed the name of my talk. Hot and spicy spam, only available in Guam. I also bought my friend Noah and his mother, Linda, to make sure he cleaned his shoes today. Okay, so who am I? So I'm Pinky, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a security consultant. I defected into security from networking about, God, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago. I've been lurking in the AusNOG kind of group for about 20 years, even though I kind of made that change. And I think the reason I do that is because I love you guys in that, you know, I watch the messages and I watch the calls for help, the ease at which people ask for help and the speed at which people come to their aid. It's a really beautiful thing for someone who works in security who's jaded by seeing lots of people doing bad things all the time. So really love you guys. Also, I stay on the mailing list because I still laugh hard whenever I see the phrase, see me, we. Now, at the time when I was asked to submit this talk, the thing that was going through my head was the amount of S.M.S spam I was getting. I'm a customer of Belong, and if you're not sure about Belong, Belong is to Telstra what Jetstar is to Qantas. It kind of seems bougie at first, and you get excited, but then when you sort of peel back the layers, you know, you think leather seats, great, but then you realize that most of the customers are bogans in bintang shirts with bali bali, and you need something that you need to wipe clean. But the Belong network is behind the Telstra cleaner pipes, and I was reading all of this amazing verbiage about how it was blocking all of these S.M.S spams. I thought, why am I still getting so many of these spams? What the heck is going on here? So that's pretty much the background of the talk. As you can see, I'm a dad, so I apologize for the jokes in advance. So the backdrop of a lot of this was that in 2023, the government released their cybersecurity strategy and outlined their vision that by 2030, Australia was going to be a world leader in cybersecurity. That weirdly changed, and we suddenly became the most cybersecure country by 2030. Now, I don't know about you. I have a massive soft spot for Claire O'Neill, and I really had a there was a time when I really thought she could move the needle on this, and then they moved her to housing. So the good news is by 2030, we probably won't all be homeless, but will we be the most cyber-secure country in the world? It's an audacious goal, and how do we sort of check goals? We'll use the SMART methodology, right? So is it specific? Yep, absolutely. 2030, Australia will be the most cyber-secure country. Is it measurable? All depends on how you're going to measure what the world's most cybersecurity country actually means. Is it achievable? Again, probably comes down to how you measure it, and I'll get into that. Is it relevant? Yes. Is it time-bound? 2030? Yes. So if we're going to do this, and it's arguably a bit of a moonshot, and you can argue that the higher you aim, the further you're going to get. You know, if we were to say, I think by 2030 we're going to be in the top 40, we probably would struggle to get in the top 40. But by having a really ambitious goal, maybe we will get further than we would, right? So what are we aiming for? Well, who knows who the most cyber-secure country in the world is today? Has anyone got an idea? Guam, North Korea, Israel. If you Google it, apparently, here's a clue, it's Denmark. Google says Denmark is the most cybersecure country in the world, and that's based on something called the ITU Global Cybersecurity Index. They map 82 countries on cybersecurity commitments across 5 pillars, blah, 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 but I don't think it's a really level playing field because The Danes speak Danish, so when a scammer calls someone called Carl Christensen and pretends to be from Danske Bank and he can't speak Danish, it's just not going to work, right? So we can't compete with that. And as some of you more astute people mentioned, there is another country that I think is knocking well above its weight in terms of cybersecurity. Zero, negligible amounts of scams. There's the clue. You've burned the punchline. North Korea, right? That's what we should be aiming for. They are doing an absolute awesome job. Very, very few scams, very, very little amount of money stealing. So let's look at the stats, right? Last year, $2.74 billion to scammers, which isn't all bad because it was $3.15 billion in 2022. 30% of victims don't report the scams, so it's much higher than we're seeing. Hang on. I'm going to have some of this wonderful orange juice I've been told about. Right, so where were we? So, to put this in perspective, current population of Australia, just shy of 27 million people. That's equivalent to every single man, woman, and child in Australia losing about $125 per year if you take into consideration that 30% people not reporting. 47% of Australians have reported exposure to fake or deceiving text messages in the last year. It's off the dial, and as you can see from the graph, the older you are, the more likely it is you're going to get scammed or the more likely money you're going to lose. North Korea does a really good job at addressing that particular statistic by ensuring their average life expectancy is a good 10 years below ours, so food for thought. The most reported attack vector in 2023 was text messages. Again, North Korea does a great job of addressing this by limiting the amount of smartphones in circulation, somewhere between 23% and 80%, depending on who you ask. I think it's probably on the lower bounds of that in terms of smartphones. There's a lot of Nokias over there. So Andy Penn heralded Telstra's cleaner pipes in about May 2020. They started with DNS blocking, looking at malicious domains. About 2.5 years later, they formally announced they'd rolled out this S.M.S blocking. If you don't know Andy, Andy is to Telstra what Alan Joyce is to Qantas. Really good at the time, but after the fact, you start to think maybe he wasn't so good. I'm a bit of a tight ass, so I'm with Belong, as I mentioned. I'm behind the filter. So I thought, let's do a bit of an experiment. Bit of a disclaimer, I'm a professional. I'm highly trained. This is very carefully controlled conditions. It was my phone. Don't try this at home. In July, I think, no, it was June. It was June this year. I sent this text message. Turn the filter off. Nothing. I waited. Tried again, nothing. Tried again in all caps. It worked. Now, think about this, right? The most common victim for scams are the boomers. You would think it would be the other way around. But anyway, should make it harder for the boomers to turn it off. But anyway, so I turned it off, and I sat back, and I thought, I waited to drink out of the fire hose for the spam that was going to hit me. And I didn't have long to wait. In they came. But really disappointingly, it turned out that in June, with the filter off, I only received 7 spammy messages. I was really disappointed. I thought, what the heck is going on? I thought, but I bet if I turn it back on, those all go away, right? So on the 1st of July, I turned it back on. Lowercase worked. Weird. So it's back on. I sat back, and I waited. Didn't have to wait long as it happened. Within a few hours of turning it back on, I got a whole bunch more. So in July, I got 6. Now, this is much less than I'd been used to seeing when I set out to write this talk. So something was going on, but I realize we're talking about very high, statistically high numbers here, so I've drawn a graph to kind of help you get your head around this. 6 with it off, 6 with it on, 7 with it off. That means it blocks about 14% of spams in my small experience. They claim to block 18.7 million scams a month. They also provide services to 22.5 million. So that means there's a hell of a lot of messages that are going through this. And to be perfectly clear, I'm not angry at Telstra for this. I'm angry at the people who sold this to Telstra. I think that potentially there's an argument that whatever Telstra spent on this solution could be added to the ACC, CCC's graph on money lost to SMS scams, right? Maybe it's like a vacuum cleaner where you have to empty the bag and otherwise it just doesn't pick stuff up. I don't know. But I started thinking, how can we actually stop scams? If you look at this through the lens of the government, there are only a few levers that they can play with, right? So the first obvious thing is education. And I'm not going to lie, I'm always a little bit cynical when the government sets out to educate people, because they always seem to default to what's the cyber equivalent of slip, slap, slop. I've been called into a room, most of my colleagues agree, they've been called into a room at some point in their career and asked to come up with a cyber equivalent of slip, slap, slop. Apparently that happened, and this is what they came up with: stop, think, and protect. I don't know how much time they spent trying to come up with something that was sort of rhyming and alliterative and onomatopoeic before they gave up and came up with this. But in all seriousness, the government has actually been doing a bang-up job of this, mainly through the ScamWatch website. They established a National Anti-Scam Centre in July 2023. They have a 3-year attack plan, which is all about collaborating with government, industry, regulators, law enforcement, to make it more difficult to scam Australians. Last week was Scams Awareness Week. I'm not sure, does anyone know that it was Scam Awareness Week last week? A few hands. So the theme of Scam Awareness Week was talk about a scam. So people were encouraged to go out and tell other people about a scam, with the idea that the more you socialize what happened and what it looks like, the more you start to raise the psyche, the consciousness of these things, which I thought was a beautiful thing. Did anyone get told about a scam last week? You thought that was a scam? Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so it looks like the government isn't doing a bang-up job of communicating that in this community. Perhaps we're a bit of an anomaly because we're all sort of a little bit nerdy, and maybe we're not as likely to be victimed. But anyway, I thought it was quite good. The next thing, that was the share a story scam thing that you all missed. Next thing they can do is around law enforcement. It boils down to what they can do at a state and a federal level, and then there's the international level. An awful lot of the scammers are obviously overseas, so it becomes about collaborating. And we have been reading about lots of good cases where law enforcement collaboration has been taking down scammers. There's a good example here of, these are a few of 30 SIM boxes that were impounded in July, alongside the arrest of 6 people in Australia linked to smishing campaigns. So we are actually seeing evidence of law enforcement both collaborating and stepping up far more than I think we're used to, which is really good. Next thing is around collaboration. So there is obviously more room for collaboration. You know, I stopped being a network engineer, I started being a consultant, and the big difference in being a consultant is I stopped pointing at things and saying that's shit, and started pointing at things and saying that's an opportunity for improvement. So collaboration is an obvious opportunity for improvement. We can see better, if we start to collaborate better between the government, the carriers, the banks, the tech companies, community orgs, we can start to get the message out there, we can start to get in front of some of these scams. You know, conceptually speaking, a telco that sees a bunch of SMS messages advertising a phishing site to their clients could not only detect and stop those messages, but they could start to block the traffic to those domains. They could inform other carriers to do the sense. They could inform the government to effect a takedown message on that phishing site. They could then take that phishing site potentially, you know, if the government can take that phishing site apart and start to look at who's being victimized, they can tell the financial institutions whose cards to block and so on and so forth. We're just not there yet, and mostly because of red tape and because there are dubious incentives in and around this. So we need to get better at that. And last but not least is regulation. The government has been increasing regulation bit by bit, as they tend to. Now, the regulatory landscape, I think, for the government looks a little bit like this. There's 3 different branches they can take. They can regulate the carriers. There are about 1,000 carriage service providers in Australia. Relatively low difficult to regulate them. I think relatively low yield. So we've seen industry codes about S.M.S. We've seen the S.M.S sender ID registry talk about. I'll talk about stir shaken. I think the problem boils down to the fact that if the telcos had a magic button they could press that stopped S.M.S scan tomorrow, it would simply do what's happened in the US after they've rolled out Stir and Shaken and move all those things onto over-the-top services. So suddenly scammers are using Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp, Bumble, Grindr, you name it, whatever. And there's an argument that being able to see it in the clear is far more useful to the government for that collaboration reason than just driving it all into encrypted space. But also because, if you look at the bottom, the tech companies, regulating the tech companies has proven incredibly difficult. They don't want to play ball for obvious reasons. There are many, many, many of them. They're all at different levels of maturity. They're all at different levels of collaboration. They've all got different skin in the game. In the middle, you have financial institutions. There are about 1,800 in Australia, according to APRA. That medium difficulty to regulate the financial institutions, because they're far more used to being regulated. They have very powerful lobby groups who are good at fighting back the government. When the government says you should do this, they're very good at compromising. And I think there's medium yield to be had by regulating the financial institutions. I think the sweet spot is somewhere in between the financial institutions and the tech companies. And what I mean by that is the financial institutions that are tech companies, the likes of PayPal et al., they can be regulated by some of those, or they can be captured by some of those regulations around financial institution to look at those. I talked briefly about Stir Shaken. That's Noah as James Bond. I'm not going to get too much into this, but essentially what it is, it's PKI for SIP. It's a technical control that allows you to verify the sender of a message so you can stop people spoofing. They rolled it out in the US. The FCC set a deadline of June 30, 2021 for major providers, and I think they had until 2023 for smaller players. So it took them an awful long time. It was an awful lot of yield. And what they're seeing is, yes, there's no more SMS spam, but there's just as many scams are going over the top. So they're now no longer seeing it. And this is what we're seeing. Same old threats, slightly different contexts. July 2022, ACMA released the industry code C661-2022, reducing scam calls and scam short messages. In short, this code sets out responsibility of CSPs to actively work to prevent scam calls and messages from reaching their customers. It outlines steps they should take to identify, trace, block scams, as well as collaborate with each other. It also prevents carriers from allowing their customers to use alphanumeric CLI. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. In February this year, they took action against 5 carriers in Australia who were flouting this code of practice. What it meant is they got a very stern letter. They were sort of named and shamed, and they were told, get your house in order or you could face fines of up to 250K. Chances are they will have stepped into line as a result of that. So we're actually saying that it's got teeth, it's being used. Now, I was really interested to see how, if I could do this, being a bit of a security nerd. Could I do, how did they do it? Could I do it? This is what it looks like. So when you can do CLI overstamping, you can set the sender message as, in this case, Combank, and it drops into, it's not really the message thread, but the phone renders it as if it was a message thread. And there's been an awful lot of financial scams have been happening. The scammers have been using this as a way to send a message that falls into line with legitimate messages from people's banks, and this is often what gets people over the line that leads to them transferring money into the scammers' accounts. It looks very convincing. It's very easy to do. But essentially, it's like snail mail. If I send you a letter and I write from Joe Biden at the White House in Washington, and you receive that, you're not going to pay much heed to it. If I want to convince you, then I have to get an official-looking letter. It has to be foolscap. It has to have an American postmark, an American stamp. Then you might sort of scratch your head and go, is this legit? But general public don't realize that this is quite easy for scammers to do and think this holds water. My argument would be to regulate the banks to stop them using S.M.S altogether. Of interest, the UK's National Crime Agency rounded up a couple of guys in London who were running something called Russian Comms, and it was a SMS spoofing, CLI overstamping as a service that they were charging using crypto, and they were selling this service to scammers all over the world. It's likely that a lot of the scams in Australia were using this service because we've started to see that dry up as a result of this being shut down. So again, law enforcement talking to each other are really starting to see the net effect. I wanted to see if I could do it. I signed up to a whole bunch of CLI gateways, both in Australia, in India, in the UK, to see if I could get them to send a message to an Australian number with a alphanumeric CLI. And every one of them funneled me into, if you want to do that, you need to apply, here's the process, you need to submit official-looking documentation, you need to supply a DNA sample, et cetera, et cetera. It was really difficult to do, and that's the result of this regulation and compliance to that regulation. I was, however, able to find a service in Australia that had a bug on their web portal. I'm really struggling to see my own screen here, but essentially what this is a nice web portal. You go in, you put in the sender number, you put in the destination number, you type in a message, and it sends it. And in order to populate that the source number, you have to enroll a mobile number in the service, which means you get them to send you a one-time password, you give them the one-time password to prove that you own that number, and bingo, you can send your message. Unfortunately, as a security guy, I realized quite quickly this is a browser-based control, which meant I could fire up something called Burke Proxy. I could catch the request as it left my browser, but before it hit the server, and then I could edit it to my heart's content. It allows me to change that number to any number I want it to be, including 0, and it sent the message. It doesn't let me change it to an alphanumeric code. That threw an error, so obviously there's another check further up the stream, which is good. But this is hacking 101. This is evidence that this company have never done any penetration testing, which doesn't surprise me as a former telco person. I guarantee that there will be a way to make this do what I want it to do, either through the API or through the web portal, or that there will definitely be Australian services that let me do that using very, very elementary hacking. This is what it looks like on my phone when it pops out. So now this means I can prank Hello Mum scammers with the best sort of Chinese menu scam ever. I can have all sorts of fun messing with people. I need to get on and tell them about this so they can hum and ha about fixing it. I thought about doing a live demo, but I've seen other people doing live demos here, and I shied away from it. So banking regulations, the government can always apply more regulation to the banks. They've got the money. They've got the lobby groups. Regardless of whether the attackers are using S.M.S. or whether they're using Signal or WhatsApp, the banks can pick up those types of scams. Interestingly, the ASIC did a report earlier this year. They looked at 15 banks outside of the Big Four to see how they were dealing with the rise in scams. They found a massive number of deficiencies in that. Essentially, what they found was that only 2% of people who were being scammed were getting their money back from the banks. If they looked at people who had complained about that, it went from 2% to 7%, which meant that 5% of people would not have got their money back from the bank had they not raised a complaint, which kind of is indicative of the banks sort of playing a little bit fast and loose in their own favor. The stats were 232 million in total scam transactions they looked at in these 15 banks. Only 19% of those were detected and stopped by the banks. 20% of those were successfully recovered from the bank, but so only 5 to 7% were given back to the customers. Now, what's interesting is the UK have released some legislation that means from October this year, the UK's payment regulator said that banks and other payment firms in the UK must reimburse defrauded customers to a maximum of £415, which is about £415,000, so $529,000 Australian. What happens is, if a scammer is able to defraud the UK's equivalent of PayID, then the receiving bank has to pay recompense the person 50% of that, and the sending bank. What it's doing is it's placing the skin in the game firmly back in the bank's court, which we'll hope it will get them to raise the bar. What it means is that, lots of banks can raise the bar in terms of stopping scams, but every time they do that, it affects their user experience for their customers, and if one bank decides to go it alone and be the secure bank, they'll quickly lose customers because customers get fed up with all the controls that banks put in place to stop those scams. If you think about maximum withdrawal limits, the first time you try and buy a car and go and try and withdraw money out of your bank to pay for a car, you get told, oh, you can only withdraw this much money today, you have to come back tomorrow and the next day and the next day, depending on how expensive that car is. You might have to spend 3 weeks trying to get the money out of your bank. Nobody likes that, but those controls are really useful for limiting the amount of money that scammers can take. So if the government regulates what the banks have to do, and they all do it at the same time, it means there's sort of equilibrium on their loss of customers or the risk of them losing customers. The banks in Australia were very firm. They didn't want to do this because they thought it would create a honeypot. And I thought it's kind of ironic because the banks in Australia know all too well about honeypots. The government in the UK forced the banks in the UK to check the account names of the recipient of funds off the back of transfers back in, I think, 2021. And the banks in Australia still do not check the account names. They check the sort code, they check the account name, sorry, the account number, but they don't check the account name, which blows most people's minds. What you find is that if the banks were to check the account name, most of the transactions would actually be knocked back because people have transposed a digit. They've said AND instead of an ampersand, or they've said, you know, Eric Pinkerton instead of Mr. Eric Pinkerton. So really what they need to do is put it back on the customers to double check, and that's what CommBank have done. They've sort of followed the model of the UK, where if you go to transfer money from your CommBank account, it will tell you that the name you are putting in does not match the bank account you are sending money or trying to send money to. So if you're trying to pay an invoice of $1 million to Cisco Systems, and it turns out the receiver is a guy who's a student called Mohammed Chan, who's only been in the country for a month, it will tell you, warning, danger, Will Robinson, this doesn't look quite right. And at the time, I was quite incensed by this because CommBank were running around saying, look at us doing all this amazing stuff for security to help our customers, when in fact they'd been told by APRA to get their house in order 2 years prior. It's just that they were the first to do this. It's actually harder than you would think because they need to know the account names of all their competitor banks, which means the banks need to share that database so that they can compare those names. But eventually we'll start to see that. I believe what happened is when the UK rolled this out, they sent an awful lot of business email compromise fraud to the US and to Australia by virtue of the fact it was really hard to do in the UK because a business email compromise fraud, it all rests on the ability to tell the victim that the account name is Cisco Systems, for example, when it's not, and that payment to still go through. So as soon as you change that, it makes it much harder, and then the scammers have to jump through even more hoops. Little bit about the technology being used. So I showed you a picture of some of the SIM cards that have been seized. You can go on AliExpress and you can buy a SIM box for about $5,800. It also comes with a whole bunch of handy instructions on how to send bulk SMS without your telco blocking your cards. The guy helpfully provides his WhatsApp address on AliExpress, so I posed as a buyer and had some dialogue with him. I made it very clear to him that I was doing things that weren't ethical or legal because I asked him questions like, how often should I move this device? You know, and then I said, what SIM card should I buy in Australia? Have you sold many of these in Australia? Yes, we have. What SIM card should I buy to maximize the number of messages I send before they get blocked? He recommended Telstra, surprisingly. I thought that was quite nice. It's quite nice of him. The guy then continued to keep messaging. I had to tell him that I'd been arrested in the end to stop him messaging me. So in conclusion, if you work for Telstra, you might want to check the Hoover bag on your filter because it sucks, but not in the way you think it does. If you work for a financial institution, watch with interest what's happening in the UK right now. If you work for the government, focus on end-user education. Pay particular attention to children. If we're going to be the best in the world by 2030, then the people who are going to be prompting GPT to do all the work by 2030 are 12 right now, so don't neglect them. We've always done a bad job of educating children about cybersecurity. We tend to think it's only boomers who get defrauded, but scammers are absolutely hosing teenage boys with sextortion scams. We tend to think, oh, kids have got it, they understand this stuff. They're absolutely getting smashed at the moment with some of these scams, so we need to do a better job of talking to them. The other thing the government could do in terms of education is what I would call better media outreach. So we see endless, the stuff that really hits home with the Australian public around these scams is when The Project or A Current Affair or Sunrise do a story about it. But often I get frustrated by the things that they say. It's clear that the journalists don't really understand what they're saying or the advice they're giving. So the government should, instead of trying to talk to the people, they should talk to the media who are already adept at talking to the people and making sure the message is right. We tend to do a lot of media outreach at Phronesis. We put our hands up to talk whenever those types of programs do stories, but invariably what happens is they interview us for 20 minutes and then they take a 3-second soundbite and present it completely out of context. More regulation for the financial institution and tech companies, less regulation for telcos, yes. I don't think it's going to be worthy. Don't forget we can all learn a lot from North Korea. There we go. Now, you've got a choice. We can do some Q&A if we've got time, or we can do a very quick story time. Do you want me to? I can lip read. Do you want me to translate?
Eric,
that was the best talk I've ever seen.
We're at time, but
okay.
We've had a discussion, and it's so engaging, and we haven't had Noah's mum come on yet, and I feel that would be a travesty. So what we decided to do is extend you another 5 minutes, and then we're going to deduct from the coffee break later to...
Okay.
Because we still get 25 minutes at coffee, so it's going to work out. So go for it.
All right, yep. Story time. So a couple of things have happened to me. I'm going to use Noah's mum as a victim here. This is a classic Hey Mum scam. You might have seen these. They're pretty prevalent at the moment. Someone will send you a message. The idea is that you think it's one of your children. It's usually opportunists. They send thousands of these out. You think it's one of your children. Invariably, your children are in trouble and need you to send them some money, which people duly do before they realize it's not their child that they've sent money to. So I decided to have a little bit of fun. But I decided to sort of spice it up a little bit. No response. Still no response. Final shot. I then sent him a link to an article in The Age about some balaclava offenders targeting the wrong house and available. Still no response. Weirdly, a month after this, there was a story about a man in Melbourne who was charged with cruel high mum text scams. I like to think it's the same guy now. I've no way of knowing that. Statistically improbable, but I like to think that he freaked out and went to the police to tell them about Mad Eddie and his involvement in a botched home invasion, and it all started to unravel, and he got arrested. Next one. While I was in the process of putting this talk together, I get another hello mum, but this time I get a hello dad scam, which is cool because it means that he potentially knows I'm a man, potentially doesn't know who I am, but I play along. So I go, what's up? Don't get a new one, we've got plenty of burner phones. If you get one from a shop, we can't be sure the cops won't be able to trace it. It's interesting that this guy has sent a message using an S.M.S, but he's asked for the response on a different number, and that response is on iMessage. So he's already flipped it over the top, probably because there's a risk that that S.M.S message, the phone that sent the S.M.S message is going to get blocked at some point by the telco. So if he doesn't want me responding to a phone that's going to get blocked, so he switched me on to iMessage, so this can't be monitored, tracked, etc. I think I've got to get him to click on a link. So what I do is I create something called a canary token. You can go to canarytokens.com and set these up. Essentially, it's a web URL. If anyone visits the web URL, it downloads a one-by-one transparent GIF, and it records their user agent and their IP address. It will say canarytokens.com, so it's a bit obvious, so you want to use a link shortener to shorten it. Then I need a pretext for him to click on the link. I make a guess that he's a sort of heterosexual male, and I send, is this the OnlyFans chick from the clubhouse, ? And almost within like 8 seconds of sending it, the Canary token triggers. I get his IP address. He's in Malaysia, of all places. Certainly not my kid. So I send that message. For translation, I have some friends in the Commercial Crime Investigation Department who will stop by and say hello in a few moments. That's the Malaysian version of sort of AFP or whatever. No response, and that's my talk.